When the barrage started, it was just like thunder.
In the Sherman tank, just by stamping your foot, you could, at 50 yards, see someone disintegrate.
It's very, very nasty, and particularly when on a burning tank, and you could hear the people screaming.
Well, I think there's no doubt about it that you live as you've never lived before or since. If every day may be your last.
It is a land where time passes nearly unnoticed. But since these men were last here, a lifetime has passed.
That is the chief of Commander Rommel. He paid a visit at my unit. That is our commander.
They are the survivors of two great European armies that clashed here over half a century ago.
I hope you didn't put too much emphasis on it, us being driven back.
Of course I did.
We retired to better position.
Oh, surely.
Right, yeah.
Former enemies, they meet in the North African desert every October. With each passing year, they are fewer in number. Members of the famed German Africa Corps and British Eighth Army, aging remnants of the two most professional, modern armies of their day. They come to remember lost friends and lost youth, from a time when all the world was focused on their struggle around a small Egyptian trading post called El Alamein. In the desert, they hunted men and machines, not land, just as warships hunt other warships and care nothing for the sea on which they fight.
It wasn't a war of one man fighting another. There was no such war. I was part of a tank unit, and the real battle was fought among the tank units. In a place like Africa, tanks and the range of their cannons were the decisive factors.
By 1942, the British found themselves consistently outclassed by the Africa Corps. With better armor and more powerful guns, German tanks often knocked out British crews before they could close within range to get off even a single shot. Time and again, frustrated British tankers raced ahead into a deadly rain of fire.
Well, they were usually in a hull-down position. They always seemed to be in a better position than we were. And, of course, going through the desert, they nearly always had the sun at their backs. And we were looking into the sun, which, again, made life very, very difficult for us.
British disadvantages went well beyond the technical. They were tactical as well. Their officer corps, steeped in tradition, was mired in a World War I mentality. Again and again, they threw their armor into suicidal head-on attacks against entrenched enemy guns.
Vehicles in the desert throw up a lot of dust. You can tell when you're going to be attacked in the desert a long time before it happens. If your opponent camouflages his position very well and keeps still and is practiced, he may knock you out with his first shot, even if he's an infantryman with an anti-tank gun. And that was very unpleasant, and that happened to the British a lot. One of the reasons why the British admired the Africa Corps so much was that they were very good at anti-tank warfare. They were good at tank warfare, they were also good at anti-tank warfare.
Of all the anti-tank guns, the German 88 was by far the most lethal. Originally built to knock planes out of the sky at 4 miles range, when leveled against tanks at only a quarter of that distance, it was devastating.
Well, I think the 88, from the beginning of the war to the end, was the greatest terror that we as tank people had. Because these things were very well handled. They were always well dug in, and they were very high velocity, so that the shell arrived before you heard the bang of the gun. And that was a most unnerving thing, because what would happen was the tank beside you would suddenly burst into flames, and then you'd hear a gunfire.
By the summer of 1942, the British Army was near collapse. In June, the fortress at Tobruk fell, along with nearly 35,000 British prisoners of war. What remained of the 8th Army fled nose to tailboard into Egypt. Showing little confidence in their land forces, the Royal Navy evacuated Alexandria and sailed out to open sea. German armored columns poured eastward in hot pursuit, with a not wholly unsympathetic Egyptian populace cheering them on. For the first time, Cairo lay tantalizingly close. And beyond the city, the Suez Canal, lifeline to the British Empire. A battle of enormously higher stakes was about to play itself out in an unforgiving land, a place where sandstorms rage for days. The men of both sides faced equal hardship. But after 2 years of crushing setbacks, British morale was at a low point. Most had little confidence in their equipment, and even less in their commanders. One officer, however, commanded respect from the men of both armies. He had in fact attained nearly mythical status. His name, Erwin Rommel, the famed Desert Fox. The son of a middle-class schoolmaster, his boldness and disdain for tradition made him perfectly suited to modern armored warfare in the desert arena.
He always talked about feeling the battle, sensing what sort of mood the enemy was in, sensing where he was weak, where he was strong. And he said you could only get that feeling by being right in contact with the enemy. The general actually had to be able to see and almost touch the enemy. And he had this phrase, Fingerspitzengefühl, the feeling you get from the end of your fingers. And he said that he won his battles by Fingerspitzengefühl.
Churchill and the British public were slow to forgive the reverses suffered in the desert. In August, the Prime Minister traveled to Egypt, bringing with him a new commander, Lieutenant General Bernard Law Montgomery. Pugnacious and confident, Monty issued a blunt ultimatum. From now on, the 8th Army will not yield a yard of ground to the enemy. Troops will fight and die where they stand.
Montgomery had a very limited aim, which was to, first of all, not to get beaten, and secondly, if possible, to win. And the recipe, the solution to that double problem, he decided was to use infantry and armor in very dense masses cooperating with each other. That's how he won the Battle of Alamein. It wasn't really a brilliant armored battle at all. It was a kind of surefire recipe for success battle.
The key ingredient in that recipe was the British defensive line at El Alamein. Stretching 40 miles from the Mediterranean coast in the north to the 700-foot cliffs of the Katara marshes in the south, it was impossible to outflank. Strewn up and down the line, in fields 5 miles deep, lay over 500,000 mines of all shapes and sizes. Rommel called them the Devil's Gardens. The British licked their wounds and began an unprecedented buildup of men and machines. For more than a month, the materials of war flowed from the United States and flooded through the port of Alexandria to the front lines, a mere 60 miles away. Rommel, meanwhile, began to wither at the distant end of a supply line stretching almost 2,000 miles. Nearly half of his supply ships fell prey to British submarines prowling the Mediterranean. Those materials that survived the crossing then had to risk a 1,200-mile journey across open desert under skies controlled by the RAF. Knowing that the momentum had shifted, Rommel prepared for the coming onslaught. 300,000 men now faced one another at an obscure North African trading post a world away from their European homes. It was clear that the last battle was approaching, the battle that would decide the outcome of the Desert War.
Well, I think there's no doubt about it that you live as you've never lived before or since when you are in that sort of situation. Every day may be your last. And in a way, we knew that. We'd get 5 days leave. We'd go down to Cairo. We'd spend every penny we had. We wouldn't go to bed. We'd be hard at it all the time. And I think in one's innermost mind, one knew it could be the last leave, and for many it was, of course.
As dusk settled in on October 23rd, Montgomery went to bed early, confident and relaxed. For his men, it would be the longest night of their lives.
When the barrage started, at 9:45, it was just like thunder. It was the most awesome sound you ever heard in your life.
At 9:40 p.m. on October 23rd, 1942, 900 British guns opened up all along the Alamein front with an intensity unequaled since World War I.
Before we started our engines up, you could hear the bagpipes, and as they moved forward, the bagpipes moved forward with them and played them into battle. And I remember we found bodies all over the place, the Highland Division.
There was a no-man's land between our minefield and the German minefield. And our infantry and engineers made 3 tracks through the minefield, and these were the routes for the armour to go through. And we had to travel up these tracks during darkness and be ready to emerge out onto the open desert with first light, as we called it, you see. But infantry found that the German defensive positions were a little bit stronger than perhaps they had hoped for.
The English were desperate. They thought they could move freely across our terrain and that nobody would stay alive. They believed that the effect on our morale would wear all of us down. But that was not the case. We let the tanks pass through, and when the last wave of tanks came, we stood up in front of the infantry. And it continued that way until the 30th.
Montgomery's plan of attack called for a massive assault near the sea. The British intended to clear the German minefields by dawn of the first day, but the mines took a gruesome toll. A week later, with some units suffering 90% casualties, they still hadn't broken through. But drastically outnumbered, Rommel knew he would soon have to break under the enormous pressure being brought to bear against him. He wrote, "We're simply being crushed by the enemy weight. The dead are lucky. It's all over for them." Included in the Allied arsenal was the new 36-ton Sherman tank with its 75mm shell. For the first time, the British held the advantage in both quantity and quality. Finally, on November 2nd, before this overwhelming weight of force, the German line collapsed. Hundreds of British tanks broke through, opposed by 35 surviving panzers. Scores of helpless German and Italian infantry fell prey to roving British armor.
Well, of course, we immediately opened up fire with everything we had and as fast as we could. I can remember seeing German infantry running about all over the place, trying to get out the way of us, you know. I have to say, we bowled a lot of them over. That was our job to do that. Just shot them with a machine gun and that was that. They fell.
I served with a young man from Germany, from Cologne, and when he saw the tanks, we were lying in a foxhole. I hung onto his feet to stop him from jumping out, but he kicked me in the face, jumped out, and was shot down right away. And our company, which consisted of 240 men, had no more than, well, I was the 6th survivor.
You can see figures in the distance and you shoot at them with the machine guns, and then you see the figures starting to run about and fall down. But it's rather as though it's in a film. It's very rare that you get close enough actually to realize that it's a particular human being who's got a moustache and ginger hair or whatever it is that you're killing. It's very rare that that happens. Afterwards, sometimes, when one goes over the battlefield and you see the dead, it can be distressing, particularly if they're very young.
They called the battle for North Africa a gentleman's war.
In the Sherman tank, just by stamping your foot, you pressed a button and you could, at 50 yards range, see someone disintegrate. And therefore you had to use words like brewing up, for instance. In the British Army, brewing up either meant making tea or it meant your tank exploding. So the dual nature of the word meant that when you talked about brewing up, it didn't sound so bad because it could be making a cup of tea or it could be yourself being burned to a cinder.
It's very, very nasty because you're thinking mainly you can get out, but then you've got your crew to get out. And that's the worst part of it sometimes, particularly when some of the crew members are wounded, arm missing or a leg missing, trying to get them out. Sometimes we had to leave them in, particularly the driver and the co-drivers. Didn't get them out at all. And particularly when on a burning tank, and you could hear the people screaming, and you couldn't do anything about it.
It was all so sordid, but one never hated them. I was wounded, and I was taken away to a field dressing station, and got there just as it was getting dark. And as I lay there, they came in with a stretcher carrying a young German soldier. I could see the green epaulets of an infantryman, and he was put down beside me. He was very badly hurt indeed. I was quite badly hurt, but he was worse. And they came along and they did the same for him as they did for me, which was to shoot the morphia in and then put the label on to say what time and how many grains of morphia you'd had. He had the same. And we lay there, and as I lay there, I felt his hand touch mine. And I grasped his hand and held it, and he pressed it back. And as the morphia went over our heads, we lay there holding hands like that. And when they came to fetch me in the morning, I saw he'd gone. And I said, "What, has he gone? You've taken him away?" They said he died. We had to take his hand out of yours.
The Axis forces in the Western Desert, after 12 days and nights of ceaseless attacks by our land and air forces, are now in full retreat.
The Battle of El Alamein ended on November 4th, 1942. 4 days later, on November 8th, 107,000 American and British troops landed on the coasts of Morocco and Algeria. Within 6 months, the battle for North Africa was over.
Contradictory to the thing to say that it was a gentlemanly war in the desert. It was an honorable war in the desert. We always, for instance, after a battle, we would rescue one another's wounded. And particularly after Alamein, when we broke through and there were all those infantry left lying there, we had to launch a major operation to rescue them before they died of thirst and exposure.
It was not a war in which either side had anything to reproach the other with. They treated each other's wounded well if they captured them. They treated each other's prisoners well. Insofar as you can like somebody who's spent some time trying to kill you, the two sides do like each other now, I think. And in a way they had a respect for each other at the time.
And I think we even did have hate while we were fighting, because we can hate a person. We cannot hate a person if we don't know him. You had to do your duty.
And now it's all over?
We were told the same, and we had to fight, but we were thinking we were fighting for a good Germany, which wasn't the truth.
Well, I had a couple of your fellas captured in my pit for a couple of days. We had a long talk. They weren't responsible for a lot of things that went there. They're the same as us. We were told to fight, and that was it.
In the cemetery there we have a brother. We two brothers.
Oh, yeah.
And in the cemetery we have another brother.
The Battle of El Alamein lasted less than 2 weeks, but the cost was high. In 12 days' time, over 45,000 men were killed, missing, or wounded.
Let me tell you that I have cried a few times already for my comrades who were killed in the war, who are here in El Alamein. My best friend, personal friend, schoolmates, they are all here at El Alamein. They died here. I'm sorry.
There are 2 lines written on the bottom of this English gravestone by family members. Lines that were meant to characterize this man, and which I find very moving. Any one of us who's still alive today and fought here could be buried in such a cemetery. We have every reason to thank the Lord every day.
Former enemies, they now sit side by side, remembering the lighter moments. Not dwelling on the fact that 50 years ago, not far from this place, they were desperately seeking one another's destruction. For many of them, Africa is a bittersweet memory of exhilaration, comradeship, sorrow, and fear, never equaled before or since. It was their youth. Now, over half a century later, they share an understanding far stronger than nationality. They share the bond of having survived. Not long after Alamein, Rommel wrote, "Rivers of blood poured out over miserable strips of land, which not even the poorest of Arab would have bothered his head over, and into a land that will very quickly forget they were ever here at all."